To our family, she'll do this to yours. I love her, she's my sister, but humanitarians and diplomats don't.
Television and speak to the British people is that you feel you've been quite seriously misquoted about your sister. I'll cut straight to the chase.
For years, Meghan Markle's story moved through the world like a polished mirror. Whatever people wanted to see, they saw it reflected back at them. Glamour, reinvention, escape. And behind it all, a silence so carefully maintained that questioning it felt almost rude. But silence has a way of changing shape over time. It stops sounding like dignity and starts sounding like avoidance. And this time, that silence didn't break from the palace. It didn't break from tabloids or tell-all specials. It broke from somewhere far more unsettling. It broke from family. Samantha Markle had been written off for years. Too loud, too bitter, too inconvenient. The easiest voice to ignore is the one you've already decided is unreliable. And for a long time, that worked. Until she stopped sounding angry. Until she stopped sounding reactive. Until she spoke with something far more destabilizing than rage. Calm. When Samantha finally stepped forward again, according to this widely discussed narrative, there was no dramatic music, no explosive accusations hurled into the void. She didn't posture. She didn't plead, she didn't demand belief. She said one sentence that landed heavier than any insult ever could. People need to look at the timeline. That was it. No verdict, no demand. Just an invitation. And once that door opened, it didn't lead to shouting. It led to confusion, because confusion is where certainty goes to die. Samantha spoke about whispers that had circulated quietly for years, according to this account. Never quite loud enough to become headlines, but persistent enough to survive. Whispers about a medical procedure, a permanent one, a hysterectomy allegedly performed when Meghan was still in her 20s. Not a rumor framed as scandal, but as something clinical. Something life-altering. And here's where the story tightens in this narrative. A hysterectomy isn't ambiguous. It's not a gray area. It's not a maybe. Medically speaking, it means the uterus is removed. And without a uterus, pregnancy doesn't become difficult or complicated. It becomes impossible. That's not opinion. That's biology. Samantha didn't dress it up according to this account. She didn't speculate emotionally. She didn't even say the surgery definitely happened. What she did was far more disruptive. She said that if it did happen, then every pregnancy narrative that followed would need a different explanation. Because there is no middle ground here. Either the surgery never occurred, or the pregnancies could not have happened as publicly described. One of those statements has to be true. Both cannot coexist. And that's when the story shifted from gossip to logic. Because logic doesn't care about loyalty. It doesn't care about image. It doesn't care who benefits. Logic just sits there, immovable, waiting for someone to deal with it. Once the question was framed that way in this narrative, people started rewatching old footage. Not aggressively. Not maliciously, curiously, pregnancies that didn't behave like pregnancies, appearances that seemed choreographed rather than physical, long gaps, vague language. Carefully worded announcements that confirmed outcomes without ever describing processes. None of it proved anything on its own, but together it formed a shape. And once you see a shape, you can't unsee it. That's when Samantha said something else according to this account that changed the temperature entirely. She didn't talk about interviews or feuds or childhood grievances. She talked about medicine, about permanence, about consequences. If pregnancy was medically impossible, she said, then the only option left is surrogacy. And this is where the story stops pretending to be scandalous and starts becoming procedural. Because surrogacy in itself is not shocking. It's not shameful. It's not uncommon. In most families, it's discussed openly and treated with care. The woman who carries the child is acknowledged. The process is documented. The truth is shared because there's nothing to hide. But this wasn't most families according to this narrative. This was royalty. And in that world, surrogacy isn't just personal. It's constitutional. Succession laws don't bend for sentiment. They don't adapt quietly. They demand disclosure, documentation, and formal acknowledgement. If a child is not born of the mother's body, it must be recorded as such, not whispered, not implied, stated. So if surrogacy existed but was never disclosed in this account, the issue wouldn't be moral. It would be procedural. A silent rewrite of rules that were never meant to be rewritten quietly. Admitting surrogacy wouldn't just dent an image. It would unravel a narrative built very carefully on visibility and symbolism. And that's when a new voice entered the record according to this storyline. Her name in this account is DL. She didn't appear as a silhouette. She didn't distort her voice. She didn't ask for anonymity in the way people expect. She looked forward and said something that froze the entire conversation in place. I carried the children, not helped, not assisted. Not donated, carried. She claimed she was the woman whose body went through the pregnancies while the world watched someone else perform them. According to her account in this narrative, she wasn't a footnote or a background participant. She was central, essential, and then erased. She described being approached shortly after the wedding. Private meetings, private entrances, contracts thicker than she expected, filled with language less about care and more about silence. She said she was promised dignity, protection, and respect. What she experienced instead, she claims, was control. According to DL's testimony in this storyline, there were always two timelines running at once. One public, one hidden. Red carpet appearances matched with clinic visits. Smiling photographs matched with hormone injections. Announcements matched with ultrasounds that weren't happening in the body being photographed. And this is where the story stops sounding emotional and starts sounding mechanical, because DL didn't say, believe me. She said, look at the records. She described appointment logs, implantation schedules, physician signatures, medical notes stamped with dates that aligned almost too perfectly with public announcements, IVF cycles beginning just before press releases, first trimester symptoms aligning with the first visible bump, second trimester milestones matching official confirmations, two narratives moving in parallel, same rhythm, same timing. Only one involved an actual pregnancy. DL claimed in this account she knew how unbelievable her story would sound, which is why she didn't rely on memory. She relied on paperwork. Ultrasound images tied to her patient ID, medical timestamps, clinic documentation, not dramatic proof but boring proof, the kind that doesn't perform, it just exists. And once that material enters the conversation, in this narrative, old footage feels different. That moment people laughed off, a bending motion, a visible collapse once dismissed as fabric or camera angle. In this storyline, it becomes symbolic, not definitive, symbolic. Because context changes everything. DL didn't gloat according to this account. She didn't celebrate. She spoke like someone tired of carrying a truth alone. She talked about silence clauses designed to last forever. NDAs with consequences severe enough to erase a life. Payments rooted through layers of distance. And then, according to her story, payments that stopped. And silence, once unpaid, becomes fragile. This is where the story pauses. Not with a conclusion, but with a question that refuses to go away in this narrative. If the public story was performance, who was protecting it? If the medical reality was hidden, who helped hide it? And if silence lasted this long, what finally made it crack? Because once someone tells you to look at the timeline, you can't stop looking. And once you start looking, the silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels occupied. Once DL's voice entered the story according to this account, the silence didn't shatter. It thinned. And thin silence is far more dangerous than broken silence because it invites inspection. People didn't rush to conclusions in this narrative. They paused, they replayed, they reread. And in that pause, patterns began to surface. The first thing observers noticed wasn't what was said. It was what had never been shown. No hospital steps. No carefully staged exit. No doctors smiling for cameras. No routine announcements with medical detail. Just a statement. Just confirmation. Just an outcome delivered without a process. In royal history, that absence was unusual. Not suspicious by default, but notable. And once DL's account reframed the context in this storyline, That absence stopped looking like privacy and started looking like insulation. Insulation from witnesses. DL described the births themselves as the most controlled moments of all according to this narrative. Delivery dates were treated like classified information. Movement was limited. Communication was restricted. Medical staff were rotated, not out of care, but containment. She said she gave birth surrounded by professionals who didn't speak names and didn't ask questions. She said everything was efficient, quiet, and deliberately forgettable. And yet, birth is never forgettable. She spoke about the physical aftermath, the recovery, the exhaustion, the emotional whiplash of carrying life and then handing it over immediately. Not in a dramatic way, in a clinical way. As if she had trained herself to describe the experience without emotion, because emotion made it harder to survive. She said she never held the children afterward according to this account. Not because she didn't want to, but because it wasn't permitted. The contracts were clear. Attachment was discouraged. Photographs were forbidden. She was told that distance was kindness, that forgetting would be easier than remembering. According to DL, that was the lie that hurt the most. Because bodies remember, even when memories are suppressed. As this testimony unfolded in this narrative, attention shifted back to Samantha Markle. People began to understand why her earlier comments had always sounded incomplete, why she had circled certain topics without landing, why she had insisted on timelines rather than accusations. She wasn't trying to convince anyone of a single claim, according to this account. She was trying to force a question that no one wanted to ask. What if the public story was never designed to withstand close attention? Samantha in this storyline described watching events unfold from a distance and feeling something she couldn't name at the time. Not jealousy, not anger, disorientation. She said the details didn't feel wrong individually. They felt wrong collectively, like pieces from different puzzles being forced into one frame. She spoke about medical language being used imprecisely, about interviews that danced around specifics, about the way words like birth, arrival, and welcome were used instead of descriptions that implied physical experience. She said none of it proved anything, but all of it suggested caution. And caution usually follows risk. The risk in this account wasn't exposure, it was contradiction. Once one detail slipped, others would have to be explained. And explanation creates witnesses. Witnesses create records. Records create permanence. And permanence was exactly what this narrative avoided. As the investigation deepened in this storyline, attention turned to contracts. Not royal contracts, but private ones. NDAs written with language that extended beyond confidentiality into erasure. Clauses that prohibited not just speaking, but existing publicly. Penalties that escalated with time. Silence not as an agreement, but as a condition of survival. DL described signing documents that referred to her not as a person, but as a carrier, according to this account. Language stripped of humanity. Legal phrasing designed to distance emotion from action. She said she didn't fully understand the implications at the time. She was told everything would be handled respectfully. That discretion was protection. That anonymity was safety. What she didn't understand was that anonymity can become invisibility, and invisibility is easy to exploit. The financial trail, as described in this narrative, was equally sterile. Payments routed through intermediaries. Amounts consistent enough to appear routine, but irregular enough to avoid pattern recognition. According to DL, the money arrived quietly and stopped just as quietly. No explanation, no closure. That's when she said the fear changed shape. At first, she was afraid of speaking, afraid of consequences, afraid of being dismissed, afraid of being erased completely. But when the payment stopped and the silence clauses lost their leverage, fear gave way to something else, resolve, because contracts rely on balance. When one side breaks its obligation, the other side regains its voice. And voices, once reclaimed, don't whisper. The story also turned toward the palace in this narrative. Not as a villain, but as a system. Systems don't lie. they manage, they prioritize stability, they preserve continuity. And when faced with a story that threatened complexity, the system would choose simplicity every time. In this account, the palace didn't ask questions because questions create liability. It accepted the version that required the least intervention. It maintained distance. It allowed the narrative to stand because challenging it would require documentation. Documentation would require disclosure. Disclosure would fracture the image, so silence was chosen, not maliciously, strategically, and strategy, once implemented, becomes momentum. The children are never questioned in this narrative. Their existence is not disputed. Their legitimacy as loved and wanted is not challenged. The story is not about them. It never was. It's about the scaffolding built around their arrival, about how far an institution will go to protect a story once it's in motion. DL made that distinction clearly according to this account. She said she never questioned why the children were wanted. She questioned why she was hidden, why her body was used but her humanity erased, why acknowledgement was treated as threat. She said the most painful part wasn't secrecy. It was replacement, watching someone else perform an experience she physically endured. Seeing smiles attached to moments that had cost her blood, time, and health. She didn't want recognition. She wanted truth. And truth, once requested, doesn't negotiate. As the narrative approached its final turn, attention returned to the original question Samantha had posed so quietly. Look at the timeline. When timelines are clean, they don't require defense. They don't collapse under scrutiny. They don't depend on silence. They stand because they align naturally. But when timelines require management, when they depend on carefully staged appearances and controlled language, when they rely on the absence of witnesses, they reveal something else entirely. They reveal intention. This story doesn't end with a confession according to this account. It doesn't end with a courtroom. It doesn't end with a revelation broadcast to the world. It ends with discomfort, with unresolved questions that refuse to disappear, because the most destabilizing stories aren't the ones that shout. They're the ones that quietly rearrange what you thought you understood. In this narrative, nothing is proven. Nothing is conclusively resolved, but something irreversible happens. The narrative loses its immunity. Once that happens, every future statement is heard differently. Every appearance is seen through a new lens. Every silence is measured. And the truth, whatever version of it exists, no longer belongs to those who tried to control it. It belongs to the timeline, because timelines don't care about power. They don't respond to image. They don't bend for titles. They either add up or they don't. And once people start counting, the story is never the same.